So, you're a Christian and you want to share the gospel with people. That is great. But what do you do when you meet people who aren't Christian? What do you do when you meet people from other world religions? How do you talk with them about Jesus? Or what do you do if you meet people who aren't even religious or spiritual at all? How do you go about sharing the gospel with them? Well, in my time on the streets of New York City, I've gained quite a bit of experience with this. So in this video, I want to give you 7 practical steps on how you can share the gospel with people who are not Christian. All right, tip number 1, don't freak out. Maybe you're doing street evangelism and you meet a Muslim. Maybe your new coworker is a Buddhist. Maybe your new neighbor is a Mormon. Or maybe the person sitting next to you is an atheist. What do? I've noticed that whenever we have people join us out on the streets to do street evangelism, one of the things that's most intimidating for them is when they meet people who are blatantly not Christian. But let's think about this. If you're wanting to share the gospel with people, shouldn't you actually be excited when you meet people who aren't Christian? I mean, these are the people you should be wanting to meet. These are the people you should be looking for. So I actually hope that you meet a lot of people who aren't Christian. And when this happens, just remain calm. Don't freak out. Don't panic. Remember, no matter what they believe, they're just people like you, made in the image of God, and remember that God is blessing you with an opportunity to share Christ with them. All right, tip number 2. Don't make assumptions. The moment someone tells you they're a particular religion, all of your preconceived notions about that religion are going to pop into your head. But the truth is, you don't actually know what they believe until you let them tell you what they believe. You need to understand that there are different streams of thought within every religion. There are different forms and varieties of Buddhism. There are different sects within Islam. Not all atheists and agnostics think the same. And even if you think you know a lot about a person's particular religion, there's no guarantee that that individual that you're talking to adheres to all the orthodox tenets of that religion. Think about how it is in Christianity. There's many different streams of thought within Christianity. There's many different denominations in the Christian church, and also many different traditions. Some things go around under the guise of Christianity, but when they're analyzed, they really can't be called Christian at all in any historical sense of the term. So how would you like it if people came up to you and when you told them that you were a Christian, they just assumed that you were the type of Christian that they were thinking of, or the type of Christian that they're familiar with? What if the only Christianity they've ever been exposed to were the extreme groups like the Westboro Baptist Church? If you tell someone you're a Christian and they immediately assume that you believe what the Westboro Baptist Church believes, are you going to feel like they treated you fairly? No. I've learned that the best thing to do is treat the individual like an individual. You want to talk to them and you want to find out what they believe. And this leads me to point number 3. Be curious. Ask them lots of questions. Really see this conversation as an opportunity for you to grow in your understanding of their religion. This really puts you in the posture of humility, and it keeps you from coming off as a know-it-all Christian. Nobody likes that. And remember, you never want to ask them questions with an accusatory tone. Wait, you're a Muslim? So are you a terrorist? You're a Satanist? Doesn't that mean you sacrifice animals and drink their blood? Don't do that. Don't ask questions that way. Remember, the purpose of asking questions is to draw them into a conversation. And if you begin that conversation with accusations, they're not going to want to talk to you. However, if you ask questions out of a humble curiosity, that's going to show people that you're actually interested in them and that you actually care about what they believe, and that's going to incline them to engage you in conversation. Remember, you want these people to open up to you, so don't begin the conversation in a way that shuts them down. So let's just say, for example, you meet someone who's a Buddhist, and if you don't know anything about Buddhism, a great place to start would just be saying, wow, I've actually never met a Buddhist before. You might be the first Buddhist I've ever met. Can you just tell me about Buddhism? Or you can just flat out say, hey, I don't know a thing about Buddhism. What does it teach? What do you believe? How does it affect your daily life? Other questions that you can ask. How did you become a Buddhist? Were you raised in a Buddhist home? Were your parents also Buddhists? So out of all the world religions, why do you ascribe to Buddhism? What is it about Buddhism that's most appealing to you? Maybe at some point in this conversation, they'll start asking you questions about what you believe. And in that point, definitely feel free to let them know. Some of the ways I like to interject in these conversations to turn things back to the Christian gospel is to ask them things like, have you ever been to a Christian church before? What's been your exposure to Christianity? Have you ever had any interactions with Christians? What were those like? Do you have any questions about Christianity that I might be able to help you answer? Remember, the purpose of asking these questions is to be personable with them, to learn about them, to learn about what they believe, and as you do that, you're gathering information that's going to help you share the gospel with them in the future in a more relevant way. And this leads me to my fourth tip: ask worldview questions. What in the world does that mean? A person's worldview basically consists of their presuppositions about reality, life, and the nature of the world around them. These presuppositions form the foundations for our beliefs and for our behavior. These assumptions become the lens through which you view the world and interpret everything that happens to you in life. Hence the term worldview. Now, everybody has a worldview. Nobody is neutral. Everybody has a set of assumptions by which they understand the world around them. But when I talk about asking worldview questions, I'm talking about asking questions that get to the assumptions upon which they've built their lives. You want to get them to analyze the things that they assume to be true. So now I want to give you sort of 6 targets to shoot for when asking worldview questions. These are targets that really hit the soft spot of the human soul and the human psyche. And really, these are the kinds of questions that every worldview tries to answer. So the first target is the question of God. What do they believe about God? This will always prove to be the most important part of anybody's worldview. As A.W. Tozer once said, the most important thing about us is the first thing that comes into our mind when we think about God. Even if someone doesn't believe in God, that is their belief about God, and that will prove to be the most important thing about them. The second target is the question of truth. How do they determine what's true? Do they believe in absolute truth? And if so, how do they differentiate between what's true and what's false? And also, how confident are they that what they believe is true is actually true? The third target question is the question of origins. How did we get here? We know that the universe exists, but how do we explain its existence? Furthermore, we know that we exist in the universe, so how do we account for our existence? Are we created by God, or is our existence just attributed to the random processes of evolution and natural selection? These are very important questions. The fourth target is the question of purpose. Why are we here? Everybody that I know is driven to some degree by a sense of purpose. And it's really interesting to me that people who don't tend to have a strong sense of purpose are usually pretty frustrated about that and sometimes downright miserable because they don't know what their purpose is. So I've determined that purpose matters because meaning matters, and people want their lives to count. They want to live for something. They want to be significant. They don't want to waste their life. So the question of purpose is profoundly important, and really the way they answer that question depends upon how they answer their other questions about God and origins. Now, the fifth target question to ask is the question of morality. What is right and what is wrong? Ask them how they distinguish between good and evil, right and wrong. Ask them who gets to decide what's right and what's wrong. You can also ask them how they deal with the problems of evil and suffering in the world. And then the sixth target question is the question of destiny. Where is all of this going? How does it all end? And what happens to you when you die? You can ask them about their concepts of heaven and hell. Ask them what determines what happens to you when you die. You can also ask them if they have any confidence about whether or not they know what's going to happen to them when they die. I hope that you recognize that each of these questions are directly related to one another, and really the way you answer one question is predicated upon how you answer the previous question. Now, as Christians, we obviously believe that any worldview that's not founded upon God's revelation in Scripture is therefore founded upon lies, which inevitably means that some of the assumptions of the other worldviews are wrong and that those worldviews therefore contain inconsistencies. Which leads me to my next tip. Tip number 5. Politely challenge their worldview. Keyword there being politely. Nobody likes a jerk. One of my rules of thumb for evangelism is never be a butthead. So as you're gathering information about their worldview and what they believe, listen for one of the following things: inconsistencies, contradictions, and insufficiencies. Let me give you an example of an inconsistent worldview. Atheism. Atheists would assert that there is no God and that the physical world is all there is. This is also sometimes referred to as naturalism. Thus, their assumption about origins is that we evolved by chance, that we came about by the unguided process of natural selection. Therefore, we are basically an accident in the universe. We were never really supposed to be here, we just sort of happened to be here. The funny thing, however, is that every atheist I've ever known seems to be driven to some degree by a sense of purpose, and I've even met some atheists who are frustrated because they haven't quite figured out what their life's purpose is. Now, why would that be? See, if their worldview is correct, then there really is no transcendent purpose or meaning to life. Nothing is really important in an ultimate sense, except maybe the procreation of your own offspring and, replication of DNA and advancing your own species. But even then, why does that really matter if your own species wasn't really supposed to be here in the first place? Do you see the inconsistency? I think it's quite obvious that the atheist is driven by a sense of purpose, and yet they assert that the universe and even their own life has no ultimate purpose. So my question for the atheist is, how did a purposeless universe accidentally create purpose-driven beings? I'll wait for you to get back to me on that one. Now let me give you an example of a contradiction in a worldview. Postmodernism. Someone who adopts postmodernist thinking would say that there is no absolute truth. But to claim that there is no absolute truth is actually a truth claim. More than that, it's actually a claim of absolute truth that there is no absolute truth. So really their worldview is self-refuting, and this should be brought to their attention. Let me give you an example of an insufficient worldview. You see, only the Christian God and only the Christian gospel can meet us in our deepest needs. Every other worldview, if we examine it carefully, is guaranteed to leave us wanting. This is especially true when it comes to people having an existential crisis. Take the issue of guilt, for example. Everybody experiences guilt for bad things that they've done. If they don't, they have a problem. So the universality of guilt is a problem for other worldviews. For example, the atheist and the naturalist can't account for guilt at all. Other worldviews might be able to account for guilt, but they don't provide us with an adequate solution to the problem. Let me give you an example of this from a friend of mine from Tompkins Square Park. His name is Bill, and he's a Buddhist. And as a Buddhist, he believes in the laws of karma, which basically means that anytime something bad happens to him in this life, it's because he's paying for something wrong that he did in a previous life. So there was one day when he was going through just some really rough stuff, and he was just venting it all out to me and basically saying that he feels like he must have done some really bad things in his past life because the laws of karma were really getting him that day. He went on to explain how much guilt he feels about bad things that he's done, and he wants to get rid of all of his bad karma, and so he was explaining to me how he's getting rid of it through suffering and through trying to do good things. But at the same time, I also know that he's an alcoholic. So I asked him, I said, Bill, I know you're trying to do a lot of good things, but let me ask you something. Is your alcoholism, is that good or is that bad? He sort of sat there quiet for a little bit, and then he finally looked at me and said, it's bad. And I said, so you're trying to get rid of all of your bad karma by doing good things, but at the same time you're doing bad things. You're drinking every day. And he shook his head and said yes. And so I asked him, well, Bill, doesn't that mean you're constantly also accruing more bad karma as you're trying to get rid of your bad karma? And he said, yeah, that's true. And so I asked him, Bill, when is this cycle of karma ever going to end? And he looked at me and just said, I don't know. And he went on to explain how he constantly feels guilty about bad things he's done. And you see, the problem is that karma offers no mercy, it offers no forgiveness. Karma is perfect justice. You will pay for every wrong you've done. And until you become perfect, you will always have karma to pay. It's a very hopeless system to be in. And so I just told Bill, I said, Bill, the way you get rid of guilt is not through doing good things, it's through being forgiven. And I went on to explain to him why the Christian gospel is such good news, because in the Christian gospel, we are forgiven by the God against whom we've sinned. And so this is an example of an insufficiency. And this leads me to my next tip. Tip number 6. Show them that the gospel is good news. Once you've helped them to see the insufficiency of their worldview, then you can show them the sufficiency of the biblical worldview and the gospel of Jesus Christ. And there are really infinite ways to do this. Let me give you just one more example. I was talking with a Muslim man a while back, and he and I were talking about our different understandings of salvation. His basic position is that, if you do good enough enough deeds, Allah might grant you salvation based upon His mercy. Of course, I told him that I think the only way someone can be saved is through belief in Jesus Christ. And we talked about this for a long, long time, and basically I just stopped him in the middle of the conversation and told him this. I said, listen to me, Muhammad. You and I both believe in a holy God. We both believe in a day of judgment, and we both believe in hellfire. The difference between you and I is this. I believe that we have a mediator. I went on to explain that if he really believes Allah is holy and really believes that Allah is just, there is no way he can expect to be pardoned on the day of judgment based upon his good deeds, because even by his own admission, he acknowledged that he has not lived a totally righteous life. I went on to explain to him that's the problem we all have, and that's why we need a Savior. And so really the point of all of this is that I'm trying to show you that the Bible gives us very clear and coherent answers to our worldview questions. But without the light of God's revelation, we're really left fumbling around in the dark. But we as Christians have the awesome task of being able to go to these people who are in the dark and being able to share the light of the gospel with them. And now this leads me to my 7th and final tip. Don't rush it. Don't assume you have to go through all of these things in your first conversation with somebody. It may take you weeks or months or even years to be able to work through all these different questions and topics of conversation with someone. Really, it depends on your setting. If you're doing street evangelism or some evangelistic outreach, you're probably going to want to be more direct and more forthright in trying to ask some of these questions and get down to the gospel issue. But if you're just talking with a friend or a coworker or a neighbor or a family member, you have a bit more wiggle room and more time to work with them, so it's totally okay to take things on a bit of a slower pace. Really, the important thing is just to understand that you can't force someone to have this conversation with you, and if they don't want to talk about these things with you, then you shouldn't try to make them talk about these things with you. It's only going to push them away, and they're not going to want to talk with you. I always try to remind myself when I'm in evangelistic situations that my hope is to share the gospel with this person, but my goal is to love them. And sometimes the most loving thing you can do is just to serve them, or just to listen to them, or just to invite them to go out to coffee with you or something like that. You may not always get to share the gospel with someone the first time you talk with them, and that's okay. Just be praying according to Colossians chapter 4 verse 3 that the Lord would open a door for you to be able to share the gospel with this person at some point. So now let's take a second to review these 7 tips. First, you don't want to freak out when you meet people from different religions and different worldviews. Second, you never want to make assumptions about what they believe. Third, you want to be as curious as possible and ask them lots of questions. Fourthly, at some point you want to start asking worldview types of questions. And then fifth, after you've found out a little bit about their worldview, you want to politely challenge their worldview. And sixth, after having challenged their worldview, you want to show them that the gospel is good news for them. And then lastly, the 7th tip is you never want to rush it. You never want to force people to have this conversation with you. And also, you should never feel pressured to have to talk to somebody about these things if the door just isn't open for it. So those are my 7 tips on how to talk about Christianity and the gospel and the Christian worldview with people who are not Christians.